King George IV was fatter than his profile picture, aka the oil-painted portrait George had commissioned his send his wife-to-be, Caroline of Brunswick. With the help of his statesmen and writers, George also made himself out to be charming, sophisticated, and a snappy dresser. Because if you're going to write a dating profile in the 1800s, why not get your court involved? But when Caroline of Brunswick met George in London, she knew she'd been duped. George had a reputation for being a drinker and a dandy. That much was public knowledge. But in person, George was bloated, spoiled, and openly ogled other women. George was, in his own words, quote, rather too fond of women and wine. George didn't care to impress Caroline either. In his letters, he never mentioned he was already married in secret before it was annulled, which Caroline would find out about later. And when Caroline arrived to meet him, George hugged her once, turned his back on her, and disappeared into his apartments. While he was fleeing from her, he shouted, "I am now well. Pray, get me a glass of brandy." Oh, did I forget to mention that Prince George was broke and needed Caroline's money and reputation to get back on his feet? Or that George's father, King George III, had gone mad? Or that Prince George IV was made fun of in the papers? There are newspaper cartoons of him from the 1800s, drunk and acting spoiled in public. George was such a disgrace and so disappointed for Caroline to meet that even Jane Austen, the author of Pride and Prejudice, took sides. Jane Austen was, of course, Team Caroline. Poor woman, Jane Austen wrote about Caroline. I shall support her as long as I can, because she is a woman, and because I hate her husband. Jane Austen, the master of spotting vanity and foolishness in men, thought Caroline had been duped long distance. When Jane Austen takes your sides, you know you're in for a rocky relationship. You're listening to The Re-Engineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, and misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Todd Lemense, the extrovert.
And I'm the writer, researcher, and introvert, Joe Anthony, whose job it is to dig through the outer layer of no-duh on the internet and get to the facts.
Long-distance relationships are a crapshoot. Dating websites want you to think that there's a special someone out there for you. But if you're lucky, you'll get a Prince George, someone who posts photos that are 10 years old, 20 pounds thinner, and a shot at that miracle angle only photographers can get. Then again, if you're unlucky, maybe your most recent photo will be seen on the evening news. Am I right? Well, that's exactly what we want to discuss today. In a dangerous world full of kidnappers, catfishers, and people who refuse to tip their servers, we want to know, what are the actual chances of finding long-distance love? We want to answer that question for you, and we'll start by busting a few long-distance myths. Myths like: Myth 1. Long-distance relationships are rare. Maybe a friend of yours left for an out-of-town fling once, but they must be an outlier. Myth 2. The long-distance relationships that work out are even rarer. If we find someone online, chances are they'll be a total King George in real life, except less pantaloons and more credit card debt. Myth 3. If a long-distance relationship ends in marriage, it's only because it was cheap or convenient. Maybe the couple was just a bus ride away. We're going to talk about why the odds of a successful long-distance relationship are more shocking than you might imagine, and what makes one work. But first, I want to talk to Joe about catfishing and photoshopping in the pre-internet era.
So when we were looking into this episode, this all really began with talking about the stats of long-distance relationships. Todd and I were just sitting down, and we started rattling off sort of like what's expected versus statistics, and it was all surprising. But more surprising was the idea that catfishing and profile picture touch-ups is actually super old.
That's what I thought. How old did you think that was, catfishing? I thought that was a 20-year-old when online dating kind of popped up.
That's actually the first time I heard about it was in early 2000s. I was like, well, that must be the invention of catfishing because that's the technology, right? So apparently King George III basically was doing it. Do you have any other examples so that we know it's not just a King George one-off?
Well, you found he took up a lot of interesting articles, and filtering and face tuning has been around since the 1700s at least. And we have all of this in our show notes, so I want you to, there's so many examples of them. I'm going to give you a couple of my favorite. There was the Roman Emperor Charles V, and he had a real powerful lineage, and they had a very distinctive jaw. So we don't know if this is from inbreeding or, but it kind of gives me that Andre the Giant jaw. You know what I'm talking about, Joe?
It's, yeah, if anyone is thinking an attractive lantern jaw, that's not what we're talking about. Could you describe the quote unquote Habsburg jaw?
It almost looks like someone with that pituitary gland problem, who's 7'6", kind of that big giant, and it's hanging. I mean, it looks like it weighs as much as your head, Joe. It's a humongous jaw.
That is a really good description of it. It does look like it comes straight from a genetic disorder.
Now, so through the years, this shows him painted as he looks. He had someone come and put his portrait in his humongous, it's very masculine, almost disabled jaw. But then through the years, it gets down to where it's not even there at all. This looks like a normal everybody.
Right.
So he was taking creative feedback and saying, how are we going to clean up this picture? And finally, his jaw gets down to small. They cover it with a beard, and he looks pencil thin. They
cover it, and like he's tucking his chin in some portraits, and the angle it differently.
He's scarfing it. They're painting shadows, just like we would with filters.
I swear I've seen people on Facebook do the same trick with their face where they like change angles and do the beard thing.
We did an episode, one of my favorite, about Napoleon and manipulation. You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
That a lot of his photos of him conquering lands and all these great battles that we've grew up with and read about in school aren't true.
Right. One we talked about was crossing the bridge. There's a painting of him on a bridge holding the flag, and apparently he got blown off it, never touched the flag, but that was sort of like his vanity.
I got an even better one, Joe, from Napoleon. Okay, there's a famous painting of him, Napoleon crossing the Alps, and it was taken by this, the guy who painted it was a famous portrait. But the model for this Napoleon picture, Joe, was the painter's son. So it wasn't even Napoleon. It was this young, handsome, tall kid.
Oh,
and not
God.
the munchkin, funny-looking Napoleon that he really was.
So that is a conversation I would love to have been there for. Like 1800s, just this painter being like, sit there, son. Like you're Napoleon today.
Dad, do I have to?
Yeah, get on the horse. Also, I think he was on a mule when he actually crossed the Alps, which that makes that sort of the same as Facebook profiles today, where somebody owns a Civic, but they're posing next to a Ferrari.
Well, I did something, and this has been brought to my attention as we started working on this episode. I have an old LinkedIn picture of me when I had a beautiful long hair, right? Now I am bald. My coworkers are shocked when they see it. And this is what they say, Joe. They say, oh my God, you look so different now without your hair. And not in a complimentary way.
Right.
Like I look like George V's jaw. You think I would take it down and save myself this embarrassment, but I just can't take it down yet.
I think that, okay, would you say that honesty in presentation is worth more than, say, being able to catfish your way into a relationship?
Yeah, I think displaying trustworthiness, especially early in a relationship, is paramount. It's everything.
Okay. Can I ask if you've ever been in a long-distance relationship?
I have.
Did you have an old profile pic?
No, because we met just organically. We met through work, or I knew the person already.
Okay, so
we were friends, and then it kind of
you didn't
progressed.
have like a portrait painter paint you in a slightly better light?
No, I wasn't trying to pick up women in Tulsa, Oklahoma. No.
Can I imagine that everybody in Tulsa dates using portraits?
Have you ever done it?
Portraits?
No.
I am currently in we're coming up on our first year. We're almost a full year now, having been in a long distance relationship. And that's where I had all these stats off the top of my head, because I like to destroy fun and ruin people's notions of odds. And this came from a conversation where we were talking about, what are the odds of our relationship working out? And I was like, oh, well, I'll just look up the stats.
Very romantic.
Yeah, our romance involves a lot of statistics and research. So
yeah, we're going to be the exception, babe. I love you, not Joe. Now let's figure this out.
It's like, no, what? Yeah, let's work out the numbers. Okay, so before getting into this, how serious did you treat long distance relationships?
I've always taken them very seriously, and I've known a lot of people in them, and I've seen mostly trauma, heartache, and hard times from them.
Okay, that's pretty much about the same thing as I have seen. The other side of that coin for long distance relationships is the kid in high school who comes back after summer vacation and he's like, I've got a new girlfriend. She's in Canada from a school you've never heard of. She totally is real. I'm not making her up, but you'll never see her.
Well, and when I was in the Army, when I was younger, all the young men, all their girlfriends, wives would end up being with their friends and stuff. It was end up to be this real traumatic thing. And then as I got older, and I've seen my friends who have a hard time meeting a compatible mate, they'll find someone online and they'll move to, let's say we live in Oregon, let's say they'll move all the way to Boston, Mass. And then about 2 years later, they'll end up displaced, heartbroken,
right,
and trying to come back home.
That's what I've seen. It's people who get disconnected first, and then they break up, and then they have basically nowhere to go except where they've landed. So we're gonna, like, those myths that we listed off, most of them are about how serious are long distance relationships, how common are they. So let's kind of tackle the serious part real quick. People who are in long distance relationships who self-report, meaning they're asked, how serious is this, when they're dating online long distance, 8 out of 10 people will say it's very serious.
And then you're saying, how could you think it's serious when they're 2,000 miles away?
Right. It's like, how could you possibly be serious that this person could be sending you paintings of themselves thinner and with hair? 1 out of 10 say it's casual. So 1 out of 10 people surveyed will say, I fly to Tulsa to hook up and then fly back and it's fine. And then the rest, which would be another 1 out of 10, they say no idea. They don't know how to quantify their relationship. The average time for these serious relationships before they become strained is about 4.5 months. So the guys that fly out, or guys and gals that fly away and get disconnected, they may have wanted to wait 4.5 months before they actually flew out to meet that person and stay there.
So there was all that new excitement, and it kind of washed off kind of fast.
Right, exactly. So do you want to get into who gets into long distance relationships?
Yes, who's vulnerable, who's Most likely, an easy mark.
Who are we gonna lose? Yeah. I almost feel like this is like a Big Brother scenario. Like who's next on the chopping block to fly away?
I'm laughing because I've embarrassed myself in this multiple times.
In a way that you could tell us a story, or in a way that we move on from?
I'm getting up to it.
Okay. I will respect that answer. By the way, all of our stats for today come from The Atlantic and Pew Research. And we also got some stats from Wanderoo, which I understand is a sex toy company. And they survey their users. So they're not a sponsor, but we will be happy to link their data article. Not their website, but where they got their information. If we're talking about who is dating long distance, it's about 4 million people who are simply living apart from their spouse. Now, that is actually less than I thought. I thought most long-distance relationships would probably be spouses that are separated by work temporarily.
I never thought that. I always think spouses are being together. I thought it would be a lot lower than that.
Okay.
Because I don't think they stay spouses for that long.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's true. If there were more people living apart like that, married, how long would they be able to carry that on? Maybe there's like a limit to how many long-distance spouses we can have in the U.S. Now, if you're walking around at work, about 1 in every 50 people you shake hands with are currently in a long-distance relationship. That's 2% of the U.S. population, 7.5 million. And the percentage of people in general, actually, I'll start with a question for fun. Do you think you are common or uncommon for having been in a long-distance relationship sometime in your life?
I think majority of people have done it. I think I'm with most of everybody. What is it?
Okay. See, I thought the opposite. I figured that most people are in a relationship of convenience. Like this may reveal a bit about my psychology. I assumed everybody was like Tindering it, where they're just looking for whoever is nearby. But apparently 90% of everyone.
It's all about location.
Yeah,
the restaurant.
It is. Picking dates kind of like you pick out a Wendy's. Like you just cruise down the highway and look for a fast food that's open. No, it's way more than I thought. It was 90% of the general public have been in or will be in a long-distance relationship at some point.
Do you think that's because once these 4.5-month things blow over and they're no longer, do you think people don't mention that in their track record of relationships?
I'm betting that, or they mention the relationship, but they don't mention how far apart they were. That it just kind of goes under their belt as that was another relationship I had, and they don't consider how weird it was that it was so far apart.
I was single for a long time. I went through a drought of not dating. And I used to hang out with I had this friend named Pete, and he was single too, and we both wanted to settle down, and we used to tease each other because we're in the city of Portland, and there's 500,000 people, so 500,000. We'd say there's 250,000 women in this city. We can't get one of them.
Right.
We have to start going to Seattle, San Francisco.
Right. There someday I will go back and find the Radiolab episode that talks about this, but there have been like the inception of dating sites basically came from a bunch of nerdy college guys came together and started doing the math on a board somewhere where they're like, if we need somebody who has a college degree, who doesn't smoke, who fits all these very specific criteria, every time you add something to that equation, it gets narrower and narrower until you're looking at 1 in hundreds of thousands. So,
well, I don't know if you know this, Joe, but before online dating, there were other ways to meet people. There was classified ads dating. You've ever heard that song where what's the name of that song? The Rupert Jones song, Pina Colada song.
Oh yeah.
So you put your stats in a little classified ad. It costs like $16 for 3 weeks.
You like pina colada, and finding out the song is about cheating. Yeah.
Yeah, so you put an ad in there, and you, like, as a writer, you write a really good ad, but you probably misrepresent yourself.
Yeah. Well, that's even better than that were the missed opportunities ads, where you would go into the newspaper and it's not even people looking for each other. It's I walked by you, and it's like, what are you doing? You're wasting your time.
Oh boy, you were so hot, and I should have said something.
Right. Yeah. I don't think if anyone has ever hooked up based on one of those ads, I would be very shocked. It's mostly, I think that's mostly a regret column. If you are doing online dating these days, there's a realistic reason why. So something from the Atlantic article we're going to link off to. They kind of broke down who is actually in a long distance relationship. Again, this one kind of surprised me. I either figured it was like old times, like when we cover history, like when we talk about, American history, the people who are sending away for a wife on like it's like the trail to the west, like if we're going, early America, usually those people who are like, post haste, send me a wife from New York, those people are doing it because they need somebody to help them with a cottage. So it's either the super poor or people who are wealthy, like the Habsburg Jaw guy, or like, George III.
Or if it's the super poor, they just need to share resources with somebody. They need to get into some kind of tribe. Right,
exactly. The modern American who is dating long distance. Well, okay, so first off, what is long distance? 4/5 of American adults live a couple hours or less from their parents, distance from their parents. So first off, we're just saying that distance is relative. Most people don't leave home. If 4/5 of all people never actually make it more than an hour away from their folks, then you're already sort of narrowing out who's going to last in a long distance relationship. But this article says that education and income are the two biggest predictors of people who actually move far from home. So that makes sense to me, because if you're too poor to move away from your geographical region, that's a reason. But also, if you don't have a higher education, you're less likely to take that risk. Like you won't have a degree that travels with you and can curry sort of like job favor effectively.
Yeah, you don't have the risk. You don't have enough chips to risk out moving to Tulsa.
Right. So of those 7.5 million people currently in a long distance relationship, they say that a particular type of couple stays in these long distance relationships, and it's the dual income, well-educated, professionally minded youngsters.
That makes sense. The courting, right? Because you need to have a higher income to pay for all that.
Right.
The planes, the hotels, the fancy meals.
Precisely. Part of it is courting. Part of it is that in the past, couples were more likely to accommodate one person's job, is what they say in this article. So, like, you would find somebody long distance, and then whoever made the most money would stay where they are, and the other person would come to them. We're getting into an era where things are a little bit more equal between men and women, as both in education and career and earnings. So these are more long-distance relationships, which exist because both people are developing their careers in two different places, and they're just designing a life that will eventually come together at a set point. Kind of like a graph where the lines are aimed to intersect later. And that seems like it can work, right? So are you ready for the big romantic moment where I told the person I'm long-distance dating what our stats are?
Again, very romantic.
The question was, what are the chances this works out? And what are the chances it doesn't? Like, what are the chances you end up with a George IV?
Drum roll.
Drum roll, please. 60%, roughly. New York Post puts it at 58%. But yeah, about 60% is how many people quote unquote work out.
You know what that is, Joe? That's a coin flip.
Yeah, that is a coin flip.
And you think that you could eliminate those by gathering the more information, being more thorough, but at the end of the day, 58%.
Right. Well, now this is kind of funny because marriage is also a coin flip that's 50-50. Divorce rates are about half. If you take that into account, 60% is actually not that bad. And 75% of people involved in a long-distance relationship eventually get engaged. So of your long-distance relationships, if you're willing to share, were you ever engaged long-distance?
I was never engaged, but there was talks of it. We were headed that way.
Okay.
That was the plan. We were talking about that probably sooner than you would on a face-to-face. One thing I want to put in on the emotional side here on long-distance relationships and why they can be so exciting is it's almost like you're always on vacation.
Yes.
You don't have the day-to-day dull of coming home from work and dragging yourself in and saying, how was your day? It sucked. It's always like you're on vacation. You're seeing new things. So sometimes it can seem like that's what your life would always be like with this person.
Right. And the way you talk long distance, it's, if you're only on the phone so much time during a day, you share the best of what you have heard that day. It's not, here's my grocery list. Oh my God, this guy at work is so boring. You don't share with them the humdrum. You share with them the interesting stuff.
And on the bad side of that, sometimes you don't have any new experience to share or to talk about. So you over talk about the one time you did this, and you only say, I love you so much.
I caught a touchdown one time. So yeah, there is something certainly to be said for meeting somebody, living with them, hearing all their boring stories. But just when we talk success, and we will get to this a little bit more in detail in this next section, but success meaning get together and last for 5 years or so. Different websites differ on what they consider quote unquote success. Some of them put it at marriage. Some of them put it at you're together for a couple years, and a relationship that lasts longer than the distance part is what counts. That's what's successful. But again, 75% of people in long-distance relationships pop the question. Only 60% of long-distance relationships actually make it. So that's a whole mess of people who pop the question, and then the relationship falls apart over Skype. In our next section, we will also talk about what makes a long-distance relationship end, how they sort of start falling apart like a car going down the highway too fast, and what makes them work. We want to talk about how to actually be successful in a long-distance relationship. But first, I'm sort of dying to know, like, when Jane Austen picks her shot as far as, like, who she's siding with, she's doing the 1800s version of Babe Ruth pointing into the stands. If she's calling it for Caroline and saying that this is going to be a wreck, I'm interested to hear how much of a wreck.
Let's start with just the motivation of this marriage. Let's forget about the womanizing, the drunkenness. At the time, it was 1795. He had a debt of 630,000 pounds.
In 1795.
Yeah, which is 65 million pounds today. And for you Americans like me, a pound is 1.3 for every American dollar.
That can't be his own debt, because that is so much drinking if that's just on him.
It's a lot of castles, it's a lot of robes, it's a lot of portraits, it's a lot of everything. Did they have gambling back then? But King George, he had a terrible reputation. I mean, he had mistresses. There's whole sections of books, I've been doing my own research on this, about just his womanizing mistresses. At least 7 illegitimate children that we know of that he kind of claimed. And he'd secretly married someone else, but it's very important of who you marry.
That's like Game of Thrones stuff right there. Okay.
But Carolyn, because of who she was kept sheltered her whole life, Joe. From when she was just a little girl, she wasn't allowed to do things that other kids were. She wasn't exposed to things. So she grew up not knowing about social things, not knowing about how people acted. They kept her because she was a prize for a prince or a king.
Okay. So she was almost, I hate to say it, but she was raised to basically fulfill this position.
Oh, absolutely. And it was a political move. They needed her mark. They needed her name to keep their family strong. So we talk about George marrying to get out of debt, but what he really needed was, if he married her, he was guaranteed to get money from the government to keep his life going.
Okay.
And it was a lot of money. So this was like a winning lottery ticket. So if he marries this woman, he gets an annual humongous tax return.
No, that is so crazy. Like, I mean, I guess here in America, if you get married, you get like tax breaks. I thought this was his father being like pressuring him into marriage with somebody eligible. This is a parliament allowance. That's crazy.
All these hardworking tax-paying people on this island. I
Right.
feel bad for them out there farming potatoes and stuff for this shit.
I'm starting to understand why there's so many negative cartoons drawn about him now.
That's a good point. Cartoons. There are a million cartoons about this relationship, and all of them paint our king here in a very unflattering light. You see him outrageously fat, drunk, stumbling around, staring at women, his tongue out, embarrassing his sweet, innocent wife, Caroline.
Right. In your opinion, having read about them and seen the cartoons that were drawn in that era, were they unfair in your opinion?
Those cartoons were dead on. King George was a glutton if there ever was one. All he did was eat, drink, and have sex. He was an absolute Joe, a positive 1700s, 1800s scoundrel.
Okay. So let me. I need to kind of reframe this for my own mind. She shows up expecting Prince Charming because he sent her doctored photographs of himself, and this guy who immediately rejects her is doing this out of mountains of debt because he wants an allowance, and he is just basically a ball of hedonism, walking around drinking and having sex all the time.
Yeah, and she's first of all embarrassed about how he acts, first and foremost, and then his appearance is misleading. And let's face it, she knows that she's being used for money. I mean, it doesn't get any worse than that, right? This guy, this pig, is using me.
Right. Do you remember the pictures that some of the media made fun of when it was President Trump in his golf pants, and they made fun of him because he looked kind of bulgy in his pants?
No, I don't remember that one.
That made the news cycles in like year one of his presidency. That awkward bulginess in his pants. Imagine that in human form, and that is George.
I can just see him sitting at a table eating those turkey legs, puking, and then not wiping it off his shirt. She said she had sex with him 3 times, and he was drunk and passed out every time.
Oh,
he didn't make it to bed a lot.
God, these are royals. Like, that's the crazy part. Like, we're talking about this. These sound like horrifying stories like your dude bros hanging out on the weekend would tell out of spite. Like, this is a royal couple.
His whole life wasn't just a bad weekend, Joe. This is what his life was daily.
Right.
One last thing until we get back to the science, your science point 2. At his own wedding, we're talking about being embarrassed and disappointed. Joe, tell me what you think about when you think of a royal wedding.
I think about the one we saw on TV, which is just elegant dresses, people showing off what their hat makers can do with swans.
Proper, right? Proper?
Proper. Yeah, proper.
Well, George, not being a proper guy, being the scoundrel that he is, staggered throughout the whole ceremony of his wedding. Piss drunk. How drunk, Joe? He had to be propped up by his groomsmen. And then when he was done with the ceremony, he passed out at his room, face first.
Okay. Did you ever read like medieval wedding ceremonies where like there's somebody there watching to make sure it gets consummated or something like that?
Yeah.
I know this wasn't happening probably in the 1790s or whatever, but I like to imagine that somebody is just there watching him sleep.
Or trying to help him finish the job.
Right. Come on, buddy, wake up.
It up while he's...
Right.
Whoever the staff is for King George and Caroline are underpaid.
Oh, my God. I wonder how much the turnover was, or if everyone was just like, I know I'm here for like, yeah, I'm here to slowly work my way into the nobility, but it's not worth it. Just let me go be a peasant. We want to go the opposite direction. We want to run screaming from this horrific matchup. Obviously, if you want to make a long distance relationship work, you do not show that much judgment, and you don't show up dying in the gutter drunk every time you talk to somebody. So we want to talk about what actually makes a long distance relationship work, especially when you like come together. Now this comes from a Queen's University research article, and this focuses on the attempts and outcomes of long distance relationships. This was almost entirely an infographic page, and so I highly recommend it. It's amazing. This basically is what started this whole episode. Now we talked about my misconception early on, which is I thought people got together because it was cheap or convenient, and that couples sort of, if they drift apart, then they're doing it because they don't think it's going to work. So everything I thought about long distance relationships was basically wrong. It takes a big man, a big man to admit when he's wrong. I stand before you in judgment. So let's first talk about the average distance. We mentioned that 4 out of 5 people never make it more than an hour away from their parents if they move out when they're adults. The average distance of a long-distance relationship is 200 to 300 miles. So not super long for most people.
That's not to France.
Right.
It's a long drive.
So the stats they're going through, there's going to be 3 categories for this, because when they survey people, some people are still in a long-distance relationship. Some people are no longer in it. And some people have broken up and come back together. So they have the same stats as far as how many people have been in a long-distance relationship. 91%. 22% of those say they reunited and are no longer doing it long distance, which means 22% came together, stayed together. 50% say they ended the relationship, and then the rest are currently still dating. It is important to note that definitions of success vary. We talked about that earlier. One might regard most relationships as failures. If you are a gal in a romantic comedy movie, every relationship looks like a failure if it doesn't end with a wedding dress. If you are more of like my hippie father, every relationship is a success because you met somebody new and you got to, delve into the human psyche with them. So when we get to our first category here of like what makes that work, what makes a long distance relationship successful, if you were to set aside a budget for long distance relationship, how much would you be willing to spend to go see your significant other, let's say once a month?
If it was someone that I thought there was a long distance, a chance to move to marriage and moving to a partnership, I would go all in.
Okay. Chips all in.
Yeah.
Okay. I am willing to lowball that down to a Greyhound bus ticket, a paper bag sandwich, and maybe a plastic rose from Plaid Pantry on the way to see them. So you're all in, and I'm at about $150.
So you're gonna wait and see. You're not gonna put yourself out there. You don't want to go. You don't want to go in the red for love.
Right.
That just has a difference to our personality, though. You're more emotionally mature than I am.
Well, okay. So I came into this thinking that if it's a long distance couple, they're going to want to save money. They're not going to spend everything getting together. They're going to be practical. And I'm wrong on all fronts, by the way. All these assumptions I had about relationships of convenience and not breaking the bank makes a good couple. Wrong.
But when attraction and lust get involved,
yes,
money goes fast.
It does. And that's backed up by the study too. So on average, the people who came together and stayed together, they spent twice as much on travel each month than those who said their relationships ended. And given that, 40% of the people who spent that much went by plane. So it was sometimes in excess of $600 a month for couples who were visiting each other regularly. That seems crazy to me. That's rent. I mean, like, depending on where you are, of course, not New York or downtown Portland, but that's still, to my mind, a lot of money. But then you also have to factor in if the majority of these people are educated, career-minded, developing their own thing, like they are developing their own life and career in their own respective cities, that starts to make a little bit more sense.
On the money thing, Joe, too, people who are more educated, have a higher income, for them, this is an investment in just not being lonely and just entertainment.
True.
To really have something to look forward to this weekend as opposed to the weekends you don't.
Right. And as we said in the earlier part of the show, people in long-distance relationships start thinking commitment earlier. So these people, they're not doing any of this out of convenience. I think the money is almost like a statement of how much you're willing to invest in the relationship before you even get off the ground. If you are in a convenience relationship in your own town, you can go years with each other before you realize you're not that into the relationship. You're not that committed. If the bar is $600 a month, you're in it. You are that committed to start with. So it makes sense when you think it out. It just was counterintuitive for me.
As does instead of taking a Greyhound bus, the slow way, you hop on the quickest flight, first class, because you can't wait to see them.
Right, that too. Yeah, let's hurry up. That said, all of my jokes and my actual cheapness aside, I take the plane. If we talk, how are people hooking up long distance? Now, of course, going to see each other and have sex is one thing, but when they're apart, do you think that people who are in a successful long distance relationship, do you think they sext more, send photos to each other more, or do more phone sex, like speaking?
Old school phone sex. I'm gonna say flirting via text.
Okay. When you said old school phone sex, my mind went to they're each calling their own preferred sex line, not each other.
Do people still have phone sex or Skype sex? Do people have Skype sex?
They must.
Oh,
I don't think that those hotlines exist anymore. If they do, they're just the three people somewhere who own rotary phones still.
No, but I mean the people still do that, or do
yeah.
They're too lazy because people don't talk on the phone anymore anyway. They just text phone sex,
Right, yeah. Phone sex nowadays is just sending each other emojis and then going about your day. Both people are busy watching like Netflix and they're just lazily texting each other. So according to this series of studies, sending photos, teasing photos, had almost no bearing on breakups. People who engaged in phone sex, actual talking sexiness to each other, like dirty talking, they did that more frequently than those whose relationships ended. This started to make sense to me because I remembered one of the articles we covered. We talked about creativity in one of our episodes, and we found in that episode that creative people stay in relationships longer. So if you're going to text somebody, one of my roommates told me, like, texting somebody sexy things, like provocative things, that's almost lazy. Like, that is almost like the bargain bin of attraction. If you actually have to verbally speak and be attractive that way, dirty talk that way, that takes a lot of creative thinking. So I guess that makes sense to me.
I think less than even the sex stuff joke. Creative people stay in relationships longer, and I'll tell you why, is they're more thoughtful. So when they go out and buy flowers, they'll take time to go to a certain place. They will write something for the person. They will prepare something. They'll care about how it looks, how it's laid out. They'll show that person their love by putting more time and more thought into it. And they'll also do that with everything. Creative people are creative people. So when they have a weekend, if you plan a weekend with a creative person, it's not the same as a non-creative person.
Right.
They do tons of research. They want it to be special. They set a higher expectation.
I think that's dead on. I think it's going to be the difference between if you are with a creative person, you're getting a homemade Valentine's card made of construction paper and rose petals leading up to the bed instead of the Walmart card that they picked up on the way.
That they bought in bulk 20 years ago and have given to all their relationships.
How did you know how I buy cards?
Hey, boy. Friggin' Joe.
Let's argue. Not you
Please.
and me. Please. So if you're in a long distance relationship or a relationship in general, how important do you think it is to avoid arguments?
I think conflict's bad, right? You want to stay away from them.
I think that's my assumption too.
Yeah.
But then again,
what good comes out of them?
Yeah. Well, I try to avoid conflict in my life in general.
Yeah,
so
it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, I don't assume. I don't want to argue with anybody really, unless it's about Blade Runner, the movies, and then I've got a lot of opinions. Now, I thought that frequent arguments would basically mean an instant breakup. I figured if people had disagreements regularly, it meant they weren't going to make it, especially long distance, because that's all you do is talk.
It's easier to break up long distance because they're not living with you, or you don't have to see them at work.
Yeah, totally. And one classic method of reconciliation is physical contact. It's hugging it out. So this data, again, it felt counterintuitive to me, but it made sense when I thought about it. They said, quote, "Our study suggests that those who successfully made it through long-distance relationships reconciled arguments sooner than those whose relationships failed or are currently still going long distance." So it's not that they argue less at all. It's there's almost a direct relation on their graph to how quickly they reconcile versus how much they stay together. So if they can argue, even if it's frequently, and they within the next 10 minutes they have reached a conclusion, they've said their apologies, they've decided who's right, who's wrong, or that they're just going to drop the subject, whatever it is, reconciling quickly means success. For every I don't remember if it's 6 hours or a day, but for any amount of time longer before you actually make up with somebody, that shows you're not going to stick together. Like the graph dramatically dropped off after one day. If you let an argument hang in the air or hang between you more than a day, you might as well hang it up.
And I get that too, because it shows a lack of caring too, that you don't have the urgency to let that person know that they're loved and needed and that you can't live without them.
Right. And it also proves that in the future, you can go to bed angry, and that's not a relationship that's, I mean, it'll last, but not long distance. So they have a real big graph here that I want to talk about. It is relationship killers. And if you follow our link, that is actually the name of the graph. The killers part is in bold red. And so it's just like all the data compiled, and here's what destroys a long distance relationship. Do you want to go through these?
Okay, yeah. I'm reading through them already.
Okay, you're cheating. Now, it's funny that at the beginning of this episode, you said that you were thinking seriousness, engagement, progressing things. The number one reason long distance relationships break apart, relationship didn't progress. And more women than men, but not by much, broke up for that reason. The difference was about 5%. More women than men. We grew apart is number 2. Lack of sex is number 3.
But don't those two go together? Relationship didn't progress and we grew apart. Aren't those two?
Yeah, they basically are.
You could kind of...
I assume we grew apart means they weren't on a schedule. That's something long distance relationship kind of rely on is you set a set time to call each other. You set a set time to, text each other good night, good morning. We didn't have that in this study, but that is something that is pretty crucial as far as long distance relationships. Set times to do things with each other every day and text each other good night and text each other good morning when you wake up. Lack of sex was the number 3 long distance relationship killer. This isn't going to surprise you, but how many men versus women do you think thought lack of sex was an issue?
Do men care about sex more than women?
It is a huge difference. It's like a 20% difference. More men, of course, care that they're not having enough sex, and that's why they break it off. The next one down is differences in social life, which is kind of like we grew apart. Financial strain of traveling is pretty high up there. That's number 5. Not willing to make the sacrifice. So this is an interesting one. You start a long distance relationship. You assume the other person is going to move to your town eventually, and they assume you're going to move to their town eventually.
Yeah, you just won't make that big final jump of quitting your job and getting rid of your place. I'm surprised the financial strain of traveling isn't a little bit higher too.
I would have thought that, especially given the statistics on how much of an indicator finance and spending is for who's going to stick together. But yeah, I guess not everybody can afford that $600 a month in plane tickets and all that. Interest in other people was actually pretty low on this graph. We are taking this by the numbers, and that was only about 20% of women, 28% of men who broke up.
I thought that would be in the 70-80%. That one day he or she meets somebody at the coffee shop or at work, and you're done because they're right there. Yeah, their relationship, their convenience, right here. How are you going to beat that when you're 300 miles away?
I was fully convinced that cheating and dating other people were going to be number 1. I did not think not progressing a relationship would be number 1. Like, I thought those would be reversed. And then the last one was no set plan to reunite. So that's a very low percentage of people who broke up for that reason. That sounds to me like laziness. That no set plan to reunite basically means, you didn't buy a plane ticket and neither did they, and so nobody went anywhere. Now, the funny part is the interest in other people was not that high on this list, but in this article, they mentioned that infidelity is like the number 1 concern of couples. And the farther and longer the physical separation is, the more this sort of like becomes something that is a mental bug. It bothers people. It sort of eats away at them. So just for fun, knowing the part where we said that lack of sex bothers more men than women, who do you think cheats more to make long distance relationships end?
Men.
Yes.
Very good.
In the study, they
King
say,
George.
Yeah, King. I didn't make that connection, but yeah, men are more likely to be George III in long distance relationships. Nearly a quarter of men in relationships that broke up admitted that they had been unfaithful. Comparison is only 6% of men said that they had been unfaithful, and yet their long distance relationship succeeded. So if you want to talk about a deal breaker, cheat if you're a man, and that will basically end things. When we talk about men are more likely to cheat during a long distance relationship, King George seemed to be all about that. How did that reflect on Caroline when she eventually moved in? Like how did her life sort of pan out with this wild partying frat boy for a husband?
There's different takes on this, but Carolyn, being in a royal family and becoming royalty at this level, they ended up living in different houses, and she ended up in some very unhealthy relationships and was rumored to have her own relationships on the side. A lot of this was just political.
Is it weird that I actually am not against that? I'm like, if you've got George III as a husband, Carolyn, get you some. I mean, why not?
Well, it's rumored that she did. And she was being an isolated celebrity and being a royal family. Let's face it, you're not normal.
Yeah. The standards aren't there.
Yeah, you can do anything whenever you want, and that just leads to a lot of mental illness. And so she was groomed for this. She was sheltered to do this, and she did the best job that she could.
Okay.
With such an uncooperative husband as King George.
Drunk that slept through their wedding and only had sex 3 times with her.
You would think that marrying a king is that fantasy that every little girl would have, right?
Right.
And living in a big, but it's not what it's cut out to be. To re-engineer a better us, we might have to treat our approach to relationships the same we would treat a serious career. If we're educated, motivated, and we put a lot of value on ourselves, we don't just turn in a job application at the closest 5 gas stations from where we live. Likewise, if we're looking for a partner who meets our specific life qualifications, we shouldn't rely on whoever Tinder throws at us because they're within driving distance. We should be willing to branch out in the same way we consider going abroad for a career. If we know what we want and we know how we'd like our lives to look, then broadening our search sounds less desperate and more practical. Thanks to dating algorithms and online chat rooms, you're more likely to find someone who shares your hyper-specific interests and values than ever before. Your odds of success from a distance are actually pretty good as far as relationships go. But there are a few catches. You have to be patient. You have to be willing to follow a plan, to see each other regularly, and make daily effort to show each other affection. And unless you want this to be the most expensive booty call ever, you have to be willing to discuss progressing the relationship. About 5 months in, if our stats are accurate. You've been listening to The Re-Engineered You. Thank you so much for listening to the show. You mean the world to us. We have a new episode every week.
You can connect with us at www.re-engineeredyou.com. That's where we have research links, show notes, and blog articles for each of our episodes. We also appreciate feedback, and we love spirited debates.
We're not experts in anything, but we've got an opinion on everything.